Last night, MPs approved England's third coronavirus lockdown. However, leading Conservatives have urged the government to allow for further votes on measures both this month and next. Following a 4-hour debate in the House of Commons, MPs approved the newest lockdown by 524 votes to 16. Only 14 Conservative MPs actively rebelling against the government. Boris Johnson suggested some of these measures might begin to be relaxed by mid-February. However, the legal powers to implement the lockdown does not expire until the 31st of March. Sir Graham Brady is Conservative MP, chair of the 1922 Committee of Tory Backbenchers and member of the COVID Recovery Group, who voted against last night's lockdown in the lockdown vote. Sir Graham, afternoon to you. Why did you vote against this?
Good afternoon, Ian. Well, I've got a number of concerns about what is being done. Some of them relate to aspects of the lockdown measures themselves. But the first issue is the one that you highlighted in your introduction, that I asked the Prime Minister yesterday what I think was a perfectly reasonable question, which was, could we, instead of just empowering the government with these very draconian powers until the end of March, could the House of Commons please have a further vote at the end of January and at the end of February to decide whether the House of Commons believes that the powers should continue? And what is being proposed instead is an arrangement whereby the government will simply decide if it thinks there is a case for a particular power to be given back to people, a particular bit of freedom to be given back to people. I think that's the wrong way round. And the most fundamental purpose of Parliament is to hold government to account and to protect the liberties of the people. Now, I've said before, liberty, freedom are not absolute. There are circumstances in which they will be constrained. And as I said in the House yesterday, it's a serious situation at the moment and some restrictions are necessary. But we ought to make sure that democratic oversight remains and that we have control over what the government chooses to do.
So essentially, you didn't want the ultimate power to retain lockdowns for 3 months to rest solely with essentially number 10. You felt this was more of a process that required members of Parliament to be involved in a decision as seismic as this.
Absolutely. And, in a sense, what we've just done is repeat the mistake that the House of Commons made back in March last year, when faced with very pressing, unknown, very worrying circumstances, the House of Commons waved through the Coronavirus Act, giving sweeping powers to the government, but for a period of 6 months. And until last autumn, and it was an amendment that I tabled that the government eventually accepted the principle of, the government was simply doing those things without debates or votes in Parliament. So I think it's a fundamental principle. They need to be tied to regular parliamentary scrutiny, and it shouldn't be for the government to decide when it wants to give up powers. It should be for Parliament to decide when the government will be allowed to have them.
And I think most people listening to this, Graham, would say this is a completely reasonable position, but yet only 14 of your fellow Conservatives voted alongside you. Why do you suppose that was?
Well, and a number also abstained in the vote last night. And I think it was a difficult situation. As I've said, I recognise that the circumstances in the country are tough. The number of hospital admissions is rising everywhere. In some parts of the country, it's more pressing than in others at the moment. But I talk to my local doctors, and they give me a very clear picture that they're under a lot of pressure already, and they see it getting worse in the coming weeks. And I think there's always a reluctance in those circumstances to be seen, possibly to be denying the scale of the problem. Well, I just felt it was important to say I don't deny that there's a significant problem, but I don't believe that it's right simply to allow government to say this is the solution and there can be no further debate on that, no further approval. And doing that leads to the other concerns. I mean, I felt throughout this process there's been too little regard for fundamental human rights. The idea that for many people it will end up being up to a year, assuming this ends at the end of March, it will be up to a year that they've been told that they
Sure.
can't see their children or grandchildren by law. And then you get to some of the frankly silly pieces of over regulation, where the habit of thinking that government can simply control everybody's lives leads them to the point where they will do things which impinge on people's freedom in ways that no sane person could justify. And the examples that I give, it is frankly bizarre that if you've been out for a walk on your own in the morning, not seeing anybody, it's illegal to go out and have a walk in the afternoon. This is something that obviously does no harm to anybody, but it is a criminal offence under these laws. Similarly, you can't go and sit on a riverbank alone with a fishing rod, even if you're a quarter of a mile from the nearest person. That is a criminal offence under these arrangements, and something I raised right way back in April because it was an obvious local issue for me with what has been a thriving local market in Altrincham, is that it's possible to go to Tesco's and buy a bunch of flowers, but you can't go to the outdoor market and buy a bunch of flowers from the flower stall, which has been required to close down, even though that is obviously a safer environment than an indoor.
Indeed. And you can sit with 200 other people in a church on a Sunday, which, again, it sort of feeds into those inconsistencies. Looking at this, Graham, and looking at what the Scottish Parliament have announced as well, they've also got this same date of the 31st of March. Are they talking to each other here? Do we have to conclude and extrapolate from that actually that's as long as the lockdown's going to last at least?
Well, I think we've got an enormous amount hanging on the vaccination programme. And we would all hope that will progress as quickly as the government intends. We hope that it is as effective as has been set out. And obviously the decision to allow a longer period between a first and second dose, which I can understand, and I think we can all understand the logic of it, as long as that doesn't lead to a lesser degree of protection than would otherwise have been the case. But what we really need to see is that as the vaccine is rolled out, as it gets into more and more of the vulnerable members of the population, we should see a corresponding process of opening up, lifting of restrictions,
sure,
getting children back to school, all of those things we want to see.
Just a very final point, Sir Graham Brady. Clapping for the NHS, or for heroes, as I think it is now, resumes this evening. Will you be clapping along?
I'm not sure what I'll be doing. I think it's 8 o'clock, but it did strike me when I heard that on the radio this morning that you're potentially getting into the same territory. If you step outside your front door into the street to clap, and you've already been out once that day, you would be committing a criminal offence under the lockdown regulations.
Good point.
Another instance of the absurdity of this sort of over-intrusive regulation.
So Graham Brady, thank you. Conservative MP, chair of the 1922 committee. I think he spoke a lot of sense on that, didn't he, in terms of where the government are at and giving that sort of ultimate power to the body and bodies in number 10, the legislature. So I always struggle with that. And throwing all of that power into the lap of the Prime Minister, ultimately, as distinct from Parliament itself. I'm a little uncomfortable with that.